Hello and welcome to Citizens Forum. This week's show is being filmed on Tuesday, March the 19th. Our first guest, Walter, our usual first guest, isn't here. So instead of the Walter and Jack show, we've got the Will and Jack show. Our first guest is Will Smith. And Will's background is kind of in finance and business, and we're going to be talking about that a little bit later on. But we're going to start off talking about the way language is used to control us, manipulate us, placate us. And you wanted to say something about the recent death of Hugo Chavez.
Yes, when I lived in Central America for about 7 years, and so I was reading a lot of Spanish language newspapers and English language newspapers at the same time, which of course you can get on the internet now. You can read anything you want for free practically. And I noticed this huge distance between what was being said sometimes about leaders in the Spanish language newspapers versus what was being said in the English language newspapers, especially in the United States. And I noticed, for example, that when one of the famous people, I can't remember who it was exactly, but it was a political leader in Panama, and in the Panamanian papers he was referred to, in every single article about him, he was referred to as a hero, and he was a very popular person. But in the English language papers he was referred to in very pejorative terms.
Now, would this be Manuel Noriega?
No. He was something more
Just
like a CIA asset or something. I don't really know that story, but no, this was somebody who was a real person in Panama. I wish I could remember, but I can't. But anyway, I've thought about this. Especially, we had a discussion when you brought up that at some point, quite recently, we changed from being citizens to taxpayers, and so that made me start thinking about it again. And the recent death of Hugo Chavez made me go back to the Spanish language newspapers to read what they had to say about Hugo Chavez. And it was quite a different picture, of course. And he was pictured as a humanitarian, and it was pointed out in the Spanish language newspapers that he had received honorary degrees from different universities and countries. And I didn't hear very much about that in the English language papers at all.
You know, I really didn't read much about the death of Hugo Chavez in our newspapers. I think because I knew the kind of direction they were going to be taking with it, which I thought would be fairly negative. I mean, Chavez was reviled by some very powerful interests in the West, and he was always presented to us kind of as a dictator, authoritarian, non-democrat, and yet I think the truth of the matter is quite different from that. You can say that about our own leadership here in Canada, that it's authoritarian and non-democratic.
True.
But from what I've heard about Venezuela, the one thing Hugo Chavez tried to do was help the poorer people in the country, to give them a standard of living that was higher than what they had before. And that's where his popularity came from. And of course, in the West, that's looked down upon, because in the West, all the wealth and resources are supposed to be going to the 1%.
Well, yes, and Venezuela is a country in transition, and it's a country that's has very rich natural resources, but they haven't been exploited anywhere near to the extent that they have been in, say, Canada or the United States. But I also think that it's just hard for us to understand, because we have a middle class here, and the middle class just doesn't really exist in Venezuela. And so Chavez was trying to bring the poorer people up into more of a middle class type of situation. And so that's just, I mean, however he chose to do that, I think it's really difficult for us to pass judgment on that, because we just simply don't understand how Venezuela works. We don't live there, and it's, every country is different and has its own culture. And I think that one of the main things is that we really do need to, in the powerful countries, we need to respect that a lot more, because we seem to think that we have the right to go in there and interfere with them just because something we don't understand or we don't like what they do. And so I think that
or
we can just,
not only we don't understand and we don't like what they do, but we want what they've got. And when I say
Right.
we, I don't
True.
mean we, the people here, but the corporations
Right.
who and the United States has a history of doing that for the last 60 years, and before that it was Britain, just going around the world, interfering with, overthrowing governments, toppling governments, creating civil wars in order to destabilize governments, in order to make sure that American and Western corporations had access to raw materials, access to resources, and access to markets. And hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people around the world have died in order to exploit, in order for those things to happen. But talking about the way language is used, we're never told it in those terms. We're always told that the American government is going in to overthrow a communist dictatorship, or to help the innocent civilians. But and this is, people say, oh, you're anti-American. This isn't anti-American because it has nothing to do with the American people. The American people have no control, basically, over their government. Their government is corporate controlled. And
yes, and a lot of times they don't even know what their government is doing. They're blissfully unaware. Well, I'd like to move into the example of what's going on in Cyprus right now. And I was reading, because the Russians are involved in that, the Russians have a lot of deposits there, I decided to do some reading in Russian newspapers.
now, before you even go on, let's
Okay.
just say that today is Tuesday, March the 19th. There has just been the big story that the government of Cyprus was going to confiscate 7 to 10% of whatever people had in their bank accounts, which threw a shock not only through the people of Cyprus, but through Europe as well. Now, we just heard a couple of hours ago that the Cypriot parliament has voted not to do that, but we wait to see what's going to happen next. And the reason for all of it is that Cyprus needs a bailout from the European Union. It's part of the monetary union. And in order to get that bailout, the EU demanded that Cyprus take the money from its citizens to help pay back. And
Right, but and it's interesting that you use the term confiscate, because the mainstream press is not calling it a confiscation, they're calling it a taxation. But in the Russian, I was reading the Russian version of Forbes, which is Forbes.ru, which is the same publisher of the United States, or the other versions of it. And they pointed out that, one of the writers pointed out that it would be they could consider it a tax if they taxed the interest on the capital deposited in those banks. But because they were proposing to just take some of that capital, that it would be considered by Russians to be a confiscation. And the number being talked about for the amount of money that Russians have in Cyprus is about, I think it's about $30 billion. But as other commentators have pointed out, who really knows how much money that, it could be 10 times more than that. So we don't know the extent of that scenario, how much money actually resides in Cyprus from the Russians. But we can say that it is the Russians do have quite a presence there, and this could be, I mean, some of the money is from Russian oligarchs, some of it's from the KGB, the ruling, I mean, Putin he's an ex-KGB agent, and he was not amused by this. I have a hard time thinking that the KGB is going to react to this with rainbows and unicorns. I mean, they don't think this is funny. It's a lot of money, and they don't see any reason that they should bail out the European Union. So here again we have trying to put a spin on it that it's a tax, that it's a bailout. I mean, this sounds like a good thing, but the real question is, who's going to pay for all this bad debt? Is it going to be the people the little people who have smaller amounts of money, or is it going to be the people who have large amounts of money who run the banks and run the system? So I think you can boil it down basically to that. The thing about all of this, though, is it's pointing out that it's very difficult to make decisions when you don't have good information or when your information is skewed. And so a French think tank has put out a paper that the URL is leap2020.eu, and they compare this to where we are right now as if we were flying in an airplane, and we normally would trust our instruments to tell us the statistics that governments put out, all the things, the reports that companies put out. We would trust those numbers to make intelligent decisions. And right now, as we're still in the middle of this financial crisis, which has not ended, it's being swept under the rug or hidden from us, we need those numbers more than ever. But more than ever, those numbers are fiction. They're made up. So we need to switch from instruments, paying attention to these numbers, to visual. Just what do we look at? What's really happening? Not what they're telling us is happening, but what is in fact really happening. And I asked my brother, who's a financial advisor in the States, how he deals with this. How does he tell people? What does he tell them? Because he has to tell them, I think you should put your money here, when they're seeing on the news, look, Apple stock is going to new highs, or whatever the particularly popular one is at this time. And he says, well, we think of it as being we've got the spin factory, which is trying to convince the herd what to do. And the spin factory is very good at this. They know how to work the herd. And they also know that if the herd gets out of control, that they're not going to pay attention to the spin factory, and they're going to want to do something else right now. And his task as a truth seeker is to give his clients the real story and to keep them from being affected by the spin factory. But he said it's a very difficult task.
So you said that what your brother is recommending that his clients do right now is stay in cash.
Sure, when you don't understand what's going on, you can make up a story, you can believe somebody, you can hope that somebody knows more than you, but when you're a professional and you're analyzing things and you can't figure it out, then you've got to take a very defensive position. And cash is a very defensive position. It gives you great flexibility. So rather than come in someday and the stock market has fallen several hundred points and having to tell baby your customers through that, if they're in cash, they're going to be okay. But it's just not time to decide which stock to put your money in, because you can't believe what's being put forth, whether it's the statistics from the government telling the rate of inflation or what a bank has on its balance sheet.
Now, you're talking about the States, but how about here in Canada? I've heard that a number of years ago, the government of Canada changed the way they measure inflation, and what used to be called inflation isn't really inflation anymore. They just measure it differently. So we're told constantly that there's little or no inflation in Canada, but every time you go to the store, everything's more expensive.
Yeah, well, they just change the they play with the language, and they change the definitions of things. So, for example, I heard a story that at some point in the U.S. government, they said, well, people aren't buying steaks anymore, so we're just going to use the steak, the part of the inflation indicator that steaks, we're going to switch it to hamburger.
Right, and that's what I was told too.
So,
it used to be that if the price of a certain kind of steak went up 10%, that was called 10% inflation. And we citizens would be told that, inflation is happening. But now, I've been told, the way the federal government measures this is that if steak goes up 10% and people switch to a cheaper cut of steak, the government now tells us there's no inflation.
Exactly.
Right? You're still eating steak, and you're still getting it for the same price. You're just not getting what you used to get. So we're being told there's no inflation, and in our system of government, or our economic system, if there's no inflation, then interest rates can be kept very, very low, which is where we are. We're at very low interest rates, and that's basically the only thing keeping our economy going. If we were told what may be the truth, that there's actually a fair bit of inflation, then under our economic system you have to raise interest rates. And these days, if you raise interest rates, this country is grinding to a halt very quickly. It would be a disaster.
Well, that's the thing, is that nobody knows what's really going to happen. But when it does change, it's probably going to change very quickly. But what we can say is that there is a lot of deception. There are a lot of things that are being swept under the rug or hidden, and eventually they do have to come out. So that's what each of us has the challenge to guard against. If we have savings, then we've got to not pay attention to what we're told to do with it. Just automatically just put it in your RSP, and there's a certain, you're going to get a certain rate of return, and you're deferring your tax. Well, in fact, as a matter of fact, those are very small considerations now. The quote I like is about 100 years old, from Mark Twain, and he said, "At this point, I'm not so concerned about the return on my money as the return of my money." And that's what each one of us has to be worried about. Imagine being in Cyprus, you're on a fixed income, and all of a sudden your bank account's gone. If you may be living on the interest from it, this could have put a hole in your lifestyle.
Well, I'm lucky I don't have any savings, just debt, so I don't have to worry about any of this stuff. But I do want to live in a stable and fairly prosperous society, which Canada used to be and is a little less so now. So to me, the best way to maintain the stability and prosperity of our country is to have democratic governments doing what the citizens want, and an informed citizenry that knows what's going on. So where would you like to see, or what directions would you like to see the country going in to maintain a stable and prosperous and happy society that extends outward into the future, and that we can all live happily in and
Well, I would love to see a stable monetary system, but I just think realistically, before we get there, we're going to have some bumps in the road, and that's a euphemism for some great difficulties.
Collapse.
Yeah, I think we're going to go through some kind of financial collapse. I think that Canada, the people in Canada in general, at least my impression from people that I know here on Vancouver Island, are very aware of that. And you have people concerned about food security. I mean, you've had guests, people concerned about food security. You had a guest about who's created a monetary system. There are alternative monetary systems. So I think people are very aware of that, and they're going to, at least here, they're not just going to throw their arms up in the air and say, okay, let's get out in the street and burn something, I'm mad. But they're actually doing something before the crisis hits. I mean, we have let systems, we have Salt Spring Island, they have their own currency system. We have people who actively barter.
Yeah. To me, all of that seems very, very small, though, because if there is a real hit to the North American or world financial system, I mean, it could be a big, big mess for millions of people at the bottom. The people at the top, I assume, will do okay.
I think you're right that there are some problems, but at the same time, I think also here we have a lot of spin, a lot of fear being generated about what's possible. I mean, if you look, for one thing, there is a phantom financial system that exists and functions very well, whether you call it the black market or the informal market or System D. It is huge, and it's getting bigger. So, for example, again, and it's true here, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head for Canada, but I remember reading several years ago that the largest crop in the United States is cannabis.
In terms of money.
In terms of money, it's greater than wheat and corn combined, and yet there's no distribution system, there's no financial market, there's no help for cannabis farmers to finance their crop, there's no futures market, there's no marketing, and yet this is the largest agricultural product in the United States, and it's completely, the United States government spends billions of dollars trying to eradicate it. So this system already exists. There's a distribution system that works for large quantities of drugs in the United States. Now, if that gets switched over to food, that could happen in a very, very fast manner. Now, that would make that would mean that you're not getting your food by driving to Safeway anymore, but still, that system exists, and that system exists all over the world, that informal economy. And it's a very important part of a lot of economies. And it's identified by the OECD as becoming, I think it was 50% of the world GDP in 2009 or 2010, and it's predicted to be 2/3 by 2015 or 2017.
It's hard to believe because we never really hear about it. We've only got 2 minutes left. But
well, it's not so big in this country, but it's much bigger. And in fact, the multinationals feed into that market. I was reading that Palmolive and these other big companies actually feed into that market in Brazil and other Latin American countries because they know it's a huge distribution system. So, I mean, I think it's a lot better than people think. You know, people spend a lot of money on taking care of their yards. If they switched over taking care of gardens instead, that would change very quickly. Russia produces 50% of its food, their staple food, by informal gardeners working on the weekends, and their growing season is only 110 days. If that were switched over here, if people, we have a longer growing season here, I mean, that would defuse that problem. There's a lot of fear. A lot of the fear needs to be diffused, and it is created and fanned by government and news media because it's how the herd can be controlled.
Yeah, and I guess when you say the word herd, you mean all of us.
Yeah, we're all susceptible to it. We all listen to it one way or another.
Okay, Will, we've got about 30 seconds left. One final sentence that we can focus on in terms of directions, positive directions to go in.
Developing alternative systems to keep your keep your lifestyle the way you like it is just paramount. Whatever, and if you're afraid of something, or if you're afraid of what's going to happen because of this or that or the other scenario, start studying it more. Look at it. Instead of just being afraid of it, how can you fix it? Be part of the solution instead of the problem. So.
Be part of the solution. Thanks for watching the first segment of Citizens Forum this week.